Am I live? I can't tell. I can't tell if it's working. What feature? What feature? Am I live right now? Is this working? About to find out. Oh yeah, there I am. That's funny. All right, let's go. Absolute character of the infrastructure and relative character of the structure. This is right where we left off. Let us now analyze the structural relationships of the superstructure model in Figure 75. We will note that the purpose of structurally analyzing the model implies the examination of the geometric values that have been affirmed about the topological infrastructure, for example, of the nodes and bonds. The objective of the analysis will procure to demonstrate that such geometric values are relative, an example, that they depend on geometric context. Once demonstrated, we will draw analogical conclusions that correspond to the actual superstructure. We will begin by repeating the question from page 84. What does the structural mode consist of? And apply its answer to the superstructure model. Answer. There is an ultimate formal pattern that cannot be decomposed through reduction. The modality of a structure is the way in which such an irreducible pattern is reproduced in the architecture of the system. First of all, let us remember that in the structure model of Figure 12, homologous to the superstructure model of Figure 75, the formal pattern is the centered cube. In order to facilitate the explanation, we have to suppose that the superstructure model is based on a cubic modality, an example on a structural mode determining that the centered cube is repeated throughout the superstructure frame as a formal pattern. Of course, this is only a didactic example, an example that will enable us to qualify the superstructure model also as a cubic structure. Now then, it is undoubtable that the formal pattern is an essential quality of the topological infrastructure. Or in other terms, the formal pattern is a capacity proper to the infrastructure and therefore a priori to the structure constituted on it. How is this character verified? Answer. By noting that the formal pattern is independent of any spatial or temporal reference in order to exist. The structural cube in Figure 75, for example, is sustained by a topological infrastructural cube. The latter, abstractly considered as the formal pattern of the superstructure model, will always be as the formal pattern, The latter, abstractly considered as the formal pattern of the superstructure model, will always be a cube, regardless of the point of observation or the moment at which it is comprehended. An example, regardless of perspective. Let us examine the answer in greater detail. As we saw, the topological infrastructural model is the structural cube's essential support. This signifies that the cube is the topological fundament upon which the most general geometric value is affirmed. An example, the act of being a structural cube. In summary, the infrastructural cube has no geometric value, although it makes it possible for value to exist for every structural cube as such. Value and structural existence ensue a posteriori from the formal pattern. The infrastructural cube is a topological quality that lacks its own geometric value, but which serves as a fundament for the existence of the structural geometric value. A structural cube can only be affirmed on top of a topological infrastructural cube. An example, that which could not exist without the presence of the latter. But the infrastructural cube as a formal pattern is irreducible and cannot be analytically decomposed. An example, it is a simple being. It determines without being determined, and although it is the cause of geometric relationships, it does not depend on any relationship outside of itself in order to exist. Thus, we arrive at the principle indicated in the previous answer. It is particularly interesting to note that it is not necessary to refer the infrastructural cube to topological space in order to prove its existence. Its evidence is inseparable from the sensitive or intelligible intuition that reveals it to reason and independently of any concrete reference. Contrary to the absolute character of the infrastructural cube, the structural cube is characterized by its relativity. This will become clear if we remember that the structural cube arises from the adjudication of a set of geometric values to the infrastructural cube. That is why it can be described as if it were a complex being and decomposed into a set of corresponding properties. But such properties are essentially relative. They depend, on one hand, on the reference of the structural cube to the geometric space, and on the other hand, to their mutual relationships. In the first case, the relativity is verified by noting that the geometric value of any property of the structural cube depends on the relationship that such a property maintains with respect to the geometric space of reference. In the second case, the relativity is verified by observing that the geometric value of a property depends on the relationships with other geometric properties. An example, it depends on the geometric context. In the first case, the relativity of the geometric value is general, and in the second case, it is special. We will demonstrate both cases of relativity in the following subarticles in order to then address the explanation of Proposition 9. First case, general relativity of the geometric value in the structural cube. Anybody watching this? One. In any structure, whatever its modality, and particularly in the cubic structure considered here, the geometric value is relative, although such a relativity may be implicit or explicit in the definition of its properties. What does the general relativity of the geometric value signify? Answer: that in the structural cube, the value of its properties depends on the relationship that they maintain with respect to the space of reference. In order to verify it, let us note that without referring the structural cube to space, it is not possible to point out its actual properties. We can only describe its ideal properties because, without spatial reference, the cube is not situated in a geometric space, but in an ideal space. We will say, for example, the structural cube has 6 faces, limited by 12 edges, which form 8 exterior vertexes, etc. Such a description is naturally ideal and therefore generic. Every structural cube responds to this general description. However, when we refer to that structural cube in particular, for example, that of figure 75, things change. If it is true that that structural cube fits the above description, it is no less true that the properties described depend in that cube on the implicit reference to geometric space. For example, it is true that the cube of figure 75 has 6 faces, but it is no less true that they are not all equal. In effect, in that cube, we must admit that one face is front, another top, another bottom, another back, and 2 others side. If we say the face of the cube, we are mentioning a property of the ideal cube. The face, a face equal to the other 6 without specific value, but, the face, a face equal to the other 6 without specific value. But if we say that face of the cube, we are implicitly pointing out a property of the real cube. A face distinct from the other 6, with the specific value that proceeds from being front, side, etc. We cannot, therefore, point out any property of that structural cube of figure 75 without it being implicitly or explicitly determined by its reference to geometric space, precisely the 3 orthogonal axes arranged to the left of the structural cube, x, t of t, y, e of m, and z, d of l, fulfill the function of representing the geometric space to which every observation must be referred. When a structural cube is referred, as in figure 75, to a geometric space, each one of its geometric properties presents a value relative to said space. If the reference is taken with respect to the point O of intersection of the axes, then vertex 3 has more value than vertex 2. For example, likewise, edge 3.7 has more value than edge 2.6, etc. Strictly speaking, if we intend to exactly point out a specific property of that particular cube, we must precisely establish its relationship with respect to a space of reference. This will enable us to ensure that the pointed out property is the same after any type of movement. If the reference is correct, a change of position, a rotation of the structural cube, for example, will not prevent us from distinguishing without error at all times this or that specific property. However, if we have remained fixed in our place of observation, we will verify that in spite of knowing at all times where vertex 3 is, it may no longer be worth more than vertex 2. In other words, the geometric value is relative with respect to the space of reference. It should be noted here that only the second case of special relativity of the geometric value will be taken into consideration in order to explain Proposition 9. The reason is that the analogical correspondence between the superstructure model and the actual superstructure would require the definition of a concrete reference of the latter to the cultural space, a requirement that would take us away from the objective of this section, an example from the cultural record. The cultural record, being analogous to a bond of the superstructure model, is clearly included in the second case, which refers to the determinations of geometric context. That is why, after the following article, the relativity of the geometric value will be mentioned without clarifying whether it is general or special. But in any case, it should be understood as special relativity. An example, that relativity of the value with respect to the geometric context. That relativity of the value with respect to the geometric context. Anybody? Any questions? Oh, hey, buddy. See you there. Yeah, buddy. Second case, special relativity of the geometric value in a structural cube. Apart from the general relativity that the geometric value of the structural cube's properties presents with respect to the space of reference, each property sees its value determined by its relationship with each one of the remaining properties. What then does the special relativity of the geometric value signify? Answer: that in the structural cube, the value of each one of its properties is determined by the geometric context. In order to demonstrate this, it is enough to point out any specific property and analyze what its definition depends on. It will immediately become clear that the more detailed the description of the property is, the more it depends on relationships with the other properties. Let us point out, for example, vertex 2. It is not just any vertex, but that particular vertex, the back upper left lateral vertex. Now, yes, in principle, we distinguish it from the other 7 exterior vertexes because vertex 2 is that which is formed by the intersection of 3 edges of the back, upper, and left lateral faces. Even if we only say that vertex and point to 2 without mentioning any reference, in truth, we are implicitly identifying it by its relationship with the 3 named faces, the vertex and the 3 faces that form it. The vertex and the 3 faces that form it are mutually related in such a way that it is always possible to identify any of them by their relationship with the other 3 properties. Here we can already see, in its most elementary definition, the special relativity that the geometric value of vertex 2 presents with respect to the faces that make it up. It is the only vertex formed by these 3 faces, but this condition, which causes its existence, reveals its existential dependence. Vertex 2 can only be such by its simultaneous relationship with the 3 faces, or, more rigorously, a point can only be vertex 2 if its relationship with the back, upper, and left lateral faces of the structural cube is such that its edges or sides intersect it. The geometric value of vertex 2 is, then, essentially relative. It depends on the relationship of coincidence at a point of the 3 edges that form it. Let us now go a little further. Let us try to define vertex 2 more precisely. This will be possible if we know more details about it, details that can be obtained by means of a meticulous description. Let us begin, for example, by highlighting that vertex 2, quote, vertex 2 lies on a diagonal line that passes through center 9 and through the opposite vertex 8. Quote. But what have we done here if not relate vertex 2 to center 9 and vertex 8? We continue, for example, noting that, quote, one of the sides of vertex 2 is common to vertex 1, another is common to vertex 3, and another to vertex 6, quote. But what have we done here if not relate vertex 2 to the vertexes 1, 3, and 6? Let us observe also that, quote, the 3 planes 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 6, and 6, 2, 3 form a right-angled polyhedron, the vertex of which is 2, quote. But what have we done here if not relate vertex 2 to an angular measure, etc., etc.? In order to complete the definition of vertex 2, one could add many details obtained in a similar manner. However, the important thing is not to improve the definition, but to comprehend that the more details we add, the more relationships are involved in the concept. However, the important thing is not to improve the definition, but to comprehend that the more details we add, the more relationships are involved in the concept. The, quote, special relativity of the geometric value of vertex 2 consists in depending on each and every one of its relationships with other properties. The set of relationships that link it to other properties constitutes the geometric context of any property. For example, of vertex 2, in the structural cube, the set of properties effectively related to a determinate property is denominated geometric context. One will thus comprehend the answer to the question, what does the special relativity of the geometric value signify? Which was affirming, in the structural cube, the value of each one of its properties is determined by the geometric context. Quote, while this answer was not demonstrated for the particular case of vertex 2, the same analysis and its conclusions can be inductively applied to the case of any other property of the structural cube. The conclusion that we must draw from the analysis is that, apart from being relative, the geometric value must somehow increase if, correlatively, the complexity of the geometric context increases. That of the, quote, complexity of the geometric context, unquote, is both a qualitative and quantitative concept. Qualitative because the complexity of a context is determined by the way the properties that comprise it relate to each other, and quantitative because the complexity of a context numerically depends on the set of properties that make it up. A change in the modality of the structural lattice can cause a context, the configuration of which is more complex. An increase in the number of properties related to a determinate property undoubtedly increases the complexity of the context. In any case, the greater the complexity of the geometric context, the greater the geometric value of the determinate property. The question now comes down to interpreting what the relativity of the value signifies, and especially how it grows as the complexity of the geometric context increases. Okay, where are we at? All right. Significance of geometrically valued special relativity. Let us remember, first of all, the warning made at the end of E6. From here on, the adjective special will be dropped in order to qualify the relativity of the geometric value. As henceforth, we will never refer to general relativity without prior clarification. There will be no possibility of confusion, and relativity should always be understood as special relativity. Having stated this convention, let us inquire what the relativity of the geometric value signifies. From the previous subarticle, we know that, for example, vertex 2 signifies a geometric value and that it is relative. However, inquiring into the significance of the relativity imposes the prior explanation of the significance's relativity. As we will see, significance and relativity are two concepts that are causally linked, like the chicken and the egg, without it ever being possible to clearly determine who started the vicious circle. Of course, in order to study this aspect of the problem of the significance, we must situate ourselves in the cultural structure on the right-hand side of figure 75. Now, in the cultural structure, a significance is analogous to a relief on the horizon of continuous signification. The significance's relief, what the subject notes, highlighted with clarity, depends on the meaningful context of a structural language. But the significance's relief is not always the same, and of course varies from one passu to another. Passu means animal man. In other words, the relief is relative. It presents different degrees of enhancement. What do the significance's degrees of relief enhancement depend on? Answer: on the complexity of the meaningful context of the language. The more complex the modality of the structural lattice in which context the significance is noted, the more its relief will be emphasized, the greater its enhancement will be. The signified relief is the imitation of a concept slice. Its greater enhancement corresponds directly to a greater comprehension of the concept. An example, to the inclusion of a greater number of semic elements proper to the truth of the entity schematized in the relationship. This means that noting a concept in a context of great complexity implies a great signified relief, and the greater the complexity of the structural context, the greater the enhancement of the signified relief, and the greater the comprehension of the truth. In order to clarify what we mean by greater complexity of the structural context, we must refer to the simple system of Figure 13, a bond and two nodes, an example of a relationship between two principles. Well, with respect to such a simple system, all the relationships that are connected with its principles constitute the structural context. This being so, then an increase of the structural context's complexity consists in an increase of the relationships connected with its principles. But it should not be deduced from this that complexity is merely a quantitative property, an example that it depends exclusively on the number of relationships connected with the common principles, because, in addition, complexity depends on the contextual configuration, an example, on the modality of the lattice. Naturally, the meaningful context is that part of the structural context, the relationships of which respond to the modality of a horizontal language. In any case, we find that the degrees of the signified relief enhancement depend ultimately on the structural context's complexity, an example, on the set of relationships connected to the common principles. In other words, the signified relief is relative because it is determined by the set of relationships that constitute the structural context. It is evident that, the significance being relative, quote, it is wrong to ask about the, quote, significance, unquote, of the relativity. However, the significance is, quote, relative in the cultural structure, and the, quote, relativity of which we inquire is that of the geometric value of the properties of the structural cube. An example, this relativity belongs to the superstructure model. The solution which eliminates the paradox consists in establishing an analogical correspondence between the significance proper to the cultural structure and the geometric value proper to the superstructure model, with which the relativity of the significance is circumscribed to the meaningful context and the relativity of the geometric value is limited to the geometric context. Naturally, the meaningful context is thus analogous to the geometric context. But this is not new. However one looks at it, it will go unnoticed that such a correlation was already described as an axiological correspondence when the second movement of the macrocosmic objective of the passus finality was studied. In Figure 73, for example, one sees that the passu puts meaning into the entity by means of an expression. The meaning proceeds from affirming the design's essential matrix, an example from the act that confers cultural value on the entity and makes it emerge as a cultural object. Meaning is thus a value, and such a value proper to the superstructure model corresponds to significance, proper to the cultural structure. In synthesis, the geometric value of any property of the structural cube is analogous to the significance of any concept of the cultural structure. Both are equally relative because of their respective contexts. This analogical correspondence between geometric value and significance reveals to us a fundamental aspect for the comprehension of the cultural objects and actual superstructures: the degrees of value enhancement. Such an aspect will become evident if we go deeper into the analogy. That is to say, as it was stated in E7, The geometric value increases as the complexity of the geometric context increases, analogous to how the signified relief increases as the complexity of the meaningful context increases. But the increase of the signified relief is highlighted by its different degrees of enhancement. Does this imply that analogously the increase of the geometric value is evidenced by degrees of enhancement? Answer. In effect, the geometric value possesses a relief characteristic for a given geometric context. If the complexity of the context is greater, the value's relief acquires a proportional enhancement. In other words, the value, which is relative and depends on the context, exhibits in an aspect, quote, that contextual rationality, that reason that determines the context of the related properties. In other words, the value which is relative and depends on the context exhibits in an aspect that contextual rationality, that reason that determines the context of related properties. Such an aspect is the enhancement of the axiological relief. The geometric value of vertex 2, for example, becomes more enhanced as we describe new geometric properties related to it, and the discovery of new properties is equivalent, as it could not be otherwise, to an increase in complexity of the geometric context. Vertex 2 then emerges. Its geometric meaning becomes more evident, acquires greater enhancement as its relationships with other properties become clearer. The geometric value of a property can be general or particular, depending on whether it refers to the whole geometric context or to another property. More clearly, if a property is examined in contrast to the context, its value presents a general degree of enhancement. If a property is examined with respect to another property, its value presents a particular degree of enhancement. For example, the geometric value of vertex 2 is general when we state vertex 2 of the structural cube in 75. On the other hand, the value is particular when we affirm vertex 2 has a common side with vertex 6. It is evident then that the particular value presents a greater degree of enhancement than the general value. If we state vertex 2 of the structural cube, its value is general because the whole context of the cube determines it. But as soon as we affirm the relationship with vertex 6, we see vertex 2 emerge from the general context with a particular degree of enhancement that highlights it and puts it in the foreground. The passage from general value to particular value supposes its enhancement in all cases. All of these concepts, as we will soon see, can be applied in order to interpret the actual superstructures. 30 minutes. We're up to proposition 9, which we've been leading up to with this explanation. This next one, I considered editing or censoring this next part, but I'm still conflicted over whether to do that. Proposition 9. Proposition 9 states the following correspondence. The geometric context of the superstructure model is analogous to the axiological context of the actual superstructure. In Article C, it was demonstrated that the external axiological context is analogous to the internal meaningful context. And in the preceding subarticle, E8, we saw the meaningful context thus turns out to be analogous to the geometric context. The geometric context and the axiological context are thus analogous, and we will not insist on this. The objective of the present subarticle will be to take advantage of such an analogy in order to interpret, in an integral manner, the actual superstructure by means of the instrument of the superstructure model. For this purpose, we will employ the structural cube figure in 75, which will represent a cultural fact of the actual superstructure. Always with reference to said figure, let us analyze how the cultural fact is constituted. In principle, there are, in the sites numbered 1 to 9, as many designated entities. According to the essential postulate, we must suppose that such entities consist of stratiform spheres similar to that which figure 46 shows. With the first movement, the passu perceives the designs and schematizes them in the cultural structure as habitual concepts. It is the gnosiological correspondence. With the second movement, it expresses the significance of the habitual concepts on the entities of reference. It is the axiological correspondence. As an effort of the expression, the essential matrices of the entities 1 to 9 are affirmed, similar to the process represented in figure 74. According to the potential postulate, PAT, each entity acquires cultural value and constitutes a node of the superstructure. At each 1 to 9 location, there is then a cultural object and a superstructured cultural fact is constituted. In principle, the 9 designated entities are distributed in physical space, in region B of the macrocosm. Upon receiving meaning, upon their essential matrices being affirmed, an aspect of the entities emerges beyond the threshold of meaning, in region D of the macrocosm. That emerging aspect has the capacity of the essential matrix and is the objective cultural appearance of the 9 entities. Such a cultural appearance consists in a set of evident properties, which is otherwise the only thing visible to the passu. Each entity remains in its original state as a support of the emerging cultural properties, as a support of the visible cultural appearance, but invisible in themselves. The 9 entities form the ontic infrastructure of the cultural fact. The passu cannot see them because it is in region B, but it recognizes, on the other hand, the emerging cultural appearance, the 9 essential matrices affirmed by its bidding expression of meaning. The superstructure of the cultural fact is constituted on the ontic infrastructure. Each cultural object visible to the passu in sites 1 to 9 manifests a cultural value that determines its meaning and the meaning of the cultural fact. The cultural value of each object is relative. Each object presents a general value referring to the context of the other objects and a particular value due to its relationship with each one of the objects in the context. The context constituted by cultural objects is thus purely axiological. The relationships between cultural objects are denominated connections of meaning and are cultural records of the macrocosm. In the superstructure model, in the structural cube of figure 75, the connections of meaning are represented as the bonds that link cultural objects 1 to 9. The relativity of the cultural value can be analogically comprehended by remembering that the value of a cultural object is analogous to the geometric value of a property of the structural cube, that the cultural object itself is analogous to a property of the structural cube, in this case to a vertex, that the connections of meaning are analogous to the relationships between properties, etc. That didn't come out right. Taking into consideration such analogies and the analyses of the previous subarticles, it is clear that the cultural value is relative and that it depends on the axiological context. The cultural value of an object can be present then. The cultural value of an object can present then different degrees of enhancement. The greater the complexity of the axiological context, the greater the enhancement of the cultural object. The complexity of the axiological context, of course, qualitatively and quantitatively depends on the set of connections of meaning that link a cultural object with the others. In order to visualize all of this, let us refer to a concrete example. Let us suppose we go to the public library to look for a copy of the Bible. I changed the word. I apologize. The cultural fact in this case is constituted by the library's cultural space and the superstructure of the cultural objects and men that occupies it. We enter the room and situate ourselves in front of the shelves of books. There, each thing that we distinguish is a cultural object to which we have given meaning. But the meaning that each object possesses has relative value, formally determined by the other objects in the context. Each object is defined by its properties, but each property acquires meaning through its relationships with all the others. We know what a library is, a place where books are kept on shelves. We go there and we recognize it. We see the books arranged on the shelves attached to the wall cemented to the floor in order to support the ceiling, etc. In truth, all of this context gives meaning and enables us to recognize the library. Neither the books, nor the shelves, nor the wall, nor the ceiling, nor any cultural object taken out of context signifies the library. On the contrary, the library is the set of cultural objects linked by connections of meaning that constitute a context recognizable as such. Between the books, the shelves, the wall, the ceiling, and all of the other cultural objects, there are actual, albeit invisible, connections of meaning that form the superstructure of the cultural fact. The cultural objects are distributed over the ontic infrastructure of the library, each one presenting a general cultural value determined by the complete axiological context. That is why, when we look at the shelves in search of the Bible, all of the books look the same. They are books, we know that, but none appears to be worth more than another because of the integrity of the axiological context that confers on them. Pardon me. They are books, we know that, but none appears to be worth more than another because of the integrity of the axiological context that confers on them a general value. Suddenly, one of the books is enhanced, and its relief stands out from the other books. We read the title on the spine and see that it is the Bible. An instant before, all the books were of equal value. An instant later, one of them manages to stand out and attract our attention. In parallel, the rest of the books, and even the context of the library, have passed into the background, have lost cultural value in the face of the relevance of the Bible. What has occurred? Answer: that in recognizing the Bible confused among the generality of the other books on the shelf, we have affirmed in it a particular value that caused its instantaneous enhancement. As we saw in E8, the passage from general value to particular value supposes its enhancement in all cases. In this, as in any other similar case, the relativity of cultural value is evident. The affirmation of the sought-after book is equivalent to strengthening its connection of meaning to us, or, contrarily, to weakening the connections of meaning that it was maintaining with the axiological context of the library. The greater brilliance of the sought book is accompanied by the fading of the context. We pass a glance around the library hall and return to look at the shelf with the books. The phenomenon takes place once again. The book emerges and is placed in the foreground in front of our eyes. We are then tempted to doubt the relativity of the cultural value. Now we know where it is. The sought-after book manifests an enhancement that encompasses all of our attention. Really, This book seems to be worth more than the others. An example, it seems to exhibit an intrinsic cultural value that allows it to stand out above the other books. Naturally, such an error can only come from ignorance of the fact that the connections of meaning determine the value of cultural objects. But such an error is frequent because the connections of meaning are invisible. However, the relativity of the cultural value is immediately evidenced, not because our book loses its particular value at some point, but because it is easy to prove that for others it has absolutely no value at all. Just as we found the other books on the shelf worthless, those other books, including our valuable copy, will seem worthless to others. Let us observe what happens when Ben Shapiro enters and situates himself next to us. We watch out of the corner of our eye and see that he is also looking at our shelf. Suddenly, he stops with a visible show of satisfaction. Something has caught his attention. It is undoubtedly the highlight of a book. It is undoubtedly the Bible. We go ahead and examine what book he has taken, and we find, to our surprise, that it is How to Make Money on the Stock Exchange. For Ben Shapiro, the Bible signifies nothing. It has the same value as the other books on the shelf. But for him, on the other hand, the presence of How to Make Money has been notable, for in that book he has affirmed a superior cultural value. I changed the name of the guy. I apologize. These examples, though trivial, have the virtue of demonstrating the relativity of cultural value and its dependence on the connections of meaning. In cultural objects, there is a general value sustained by the integrity of the axiological context, as in the books of the library, the general value of which allows them to be books and to be on the shelf without standing out from one another. But cultural objects also present particular values, depending on whom a determinate connection of meaning refers to. Certain special connections of meaning with God, with the homeland, with the home, etc., can confer to a book, for example, that which we were looking for, a particular value superior to that of other cultural objects. And this particular value, as we have seen, causes the effective enhancement of the cultural object over the general value. Logically, the example of the library can be questioned by arguing that the book's connections of meaning, those that refer to its literary content, are not real. An example that they are the projections of ideal relationships. In order to prove that such an argument is fallacious, it is enough to replace the books with tools and the library with a hardware store. The tools are distributed on the shelves without standing out from each other, although each one has a general value that confers on them not only the axiological context of the hardware store, but also that of the entire external cultural's superstructure. If we are blacksmiths and we go to look, for example, for an iron hammer, it is certain that it will emerge above the other tools as soon as we recognize it and affirm it in it a particular value. If next to our iron hammer there is another of wood, it is possible that we do not notice it, that it has no value for us. However, the carpenter who has entered the hardware store behind us to also look for a hammer quickly goes to take the wooden hammer, the highlighting of which makes it stand out from the other tools, including our valuable iron hammer. For the carpenter, the wooden hammer has a particular value, a utilitarian value based on its function of adjusting wooden wedges. Instead, the iron hammer, which is not useful, lacks a utilitarian value, and therefore meaning. The carpenter does not even see it, because for him it signifies nothing, and so he does not attach any meaning to it. He does not affirm any particular value in it. In summary, all of the hammers on the shelf, of different shapes and materials, are cultural objects endowed with the general value of being hammers, conferred by the axiological context. Each one of them can exhibit, in addition, a particular value determined by some connections of meaning that formalize their function. For example, the relationship of the iron hammer to the nails and of the wooden hammer to the wedges. And these connections of meaning, which highlight a particular value of each hammer, are relationships between actual things and not mere imaginary projections. The Hyperborean initiate's faculty of anamnesis makes it possible to explore the cultural records. Now, the cultural records are the connections of meaning between cultural objects, and they are those that determine the value. The general value acting in the whole of the axiological context, or the particular value when some of them are separately confirmed. The comprehension of the cultural record demands, then, to be approached by means of a detailed analysis of the cultural value. Especially, we must comprehend on what principle the general value is sustained and in what way the particular value modifies it. The superstructure model facilitates the answers, as we will see in the following subarticles, after which we will go on to describe the possibilities of the faculty of anamnesis. All right. 51 minutes. Don't think I'm going to go on from here. Or if I do, it'll be after a quick break for water. Do I have 2 people watching? Is that what that means? I've never, ever gone live. How's my audio? You guys hear everything okay? Is the music too loud? Can you even hear the music? I actually have music playing in the background. Got like, all right, music's good. That sounds good. Whatever. I don't know. No idea. Don't take this too seriously. I take it very seriously, but I know when to laugh. Everything's cool. Let's see. What do we have next? This was the part. Oh, thanks, buddy. Thanks for letting me know. I chose this part of the book to read because it's relatively innocuous, and it also really stuck out to me when I was reading it. It was a big aha moment. I'm going to keep going until I hear noises upstairs, which would interrupt the stream, and then I'll stop. Superstructure and the general value of cultural objects. The first thing that should be noted here is that all the members of a cultural community equally participate in the general value of each cultural object. This being so, does this mean that the general value is present in the cultural object, regardless of the particular recognition of each member? Answer. The answer is affirmative. The general value subsists in the cultural object even in the case in which no passu is found in the context in order to express its meaning. And the explanation is as follows. As stated in the third commentary, the macrocosmic objective of the finality aims, in the first place, at placing meaning on the world. In order to fulfill such a finality, it is not enough to grant meaning to the entities by means of some form of expression. It is also necessary that said meaning endures and is reaffirmed again and again after a perpetual search and discovery of the design, of a truth that never ends up being completely revealed to reason. That search, that discovery, that reaffirmation, they please the demiurge. They form part of the object of his pleasure. An external superstructure that sustains the meaning granted to the entities is then required. To construct such a superstructure is a collective task, and languages are the tool with which the PASU is endowed to undertake it. The meaning collectively placed on an entity, an example, the general value of a cultural object, endures because it is sustained in the entity by the actual superstructure. When a cultural object is collectively known and integrates the superstructure of that culture, its general value is preserved in the object, independently of the particular recognition of its members. An example, the general value is collective and indifferent to any individual act. Once a cultural object has emerged from the threshold of meaning with a general value and has been incorporated into the superstructure, it remains manifested in the sphere of meaning. The general value causes the collective evidence of the cultural object. Thus, the axiological context not only determines the general value, and with it the cultural object's degree of enhancement, but also sustains such a value in the object and causes its permanent enhancement. Let us remember that the axiological context consists of the set of cultural objects that make up the superstructure with respect to a determinate cultural object. These sentences, of course, raise an unavoidable question. What principle does the superstructure use in order to sustain the general value in a determinate cultural object? Answer: a principle of vitality. If the whole macrocosm, in effect, is vivified by the anima mundi of the One, all the more so will be the superstructures that exist in its interior. The comprehension of such a consequence, being logical, offers no problems, but the answer has a more precise significance and clearly requires establishing a distinction in this indubitable vitality of the macrocosmic contents. An example, one thing is the ontic vitality, which consists of the evolutive impulse that flows from the entity's being in itself, and which, for that reason, is an entity's principle of interior vitality. And another thing is the vitality that sustains the cultural value, which manifests itself a posteriori to the designated entity, from the movement in which the PASU points out the essential matrix and discovers it to the collective view. From that moment, when the general value of the cultural object is evident to all, the entity's principle of exterior vitality acts, which preserves the evidence of the cultural value. Let us remember that we have denominated the archetypes that act externally as psychoid archetypes. The Hyperborean wisdom distinguishes from the set of psychoid archetypes egregores or myths, the archetypes that only vitalize the superstructures, which it particularly denominates astral archetypes. With this concept, we can specify the significance of the previous answer. Answer: the superstructures sustain the general value due to the effect of the principle of astral vitality. Naturally, the astral vitality is infused from the exterior of the cultural object by the astral archetype of the superstructure. But we already knew this action of the astral psychoid archetype in the 13th commentary. For example, it says, "But it should not be naively believed that the superstructures are mere projections of the internal cultural structure of the PASU. On the contrary, the superstructures possess life of their own. They are capable not only of integrating man into their complexion, but of determining his will. Although we will return to the subject in another section, we may now ask, what is the mind that, analogously to the cultural subject in the internal cultural structure, animates these external superstructures? Answer: a class of archetypes denominated psychoid or egregore. While a superstructure can be the support of an entire exterior culture, since inversely a culture is the capacity of a superstructure, here we are referring to a lesser form denominated cultural fact, which is likewise the exterior manifestation of a superstructure. The cultural fact, in general, is analogous to the structural cube of the superstructure model of Figure 75, and we will refer to it later in order to exemplify the principle of astral vitality. In the meantime, what must be kept in mind is that the superstructure of the cultural fact is animated by an astral archetype. With this clarification, we can take care of getting to know the principle of astral vitality and its effect better. The law of conservation of cultural objects' general value. The problem consists in establishing how the astral archetype infuses its vitality into the cultural object and how such a vitality preserves the cultural object's general value. Let us begin by remembering some concepts already studied in the energetic character of the emergence of the cultural fact. When speaking of emergence of the cultural fact, we are implicitly alluding to movement, an example, to an act that in the macrocosm is essentially energetic. This we had already said on page 414. The cultural fact, as an I symbol emerging in the consciousness, is directed to the consciousness of the demiurge, i.e., to the conscious sphere of world meaning, D, guided by its first intention, human pain. The pain, or first intention, is an energetic note of the cultural fact. Dramatically incorporated into the exterior plot, the virya fulfills the macrocosmic objective of the finality to the highest degree, since the meaning that he places on the world is that which the demiurge appreciates the most. In other words, in his dramatic performance, the virya expresses an intense meaning which has the dimension of pain, and which is in reality comprised of two forces denominated love and hate. The pain, which the virya puts into a cultural fact that dramatically includes him, is analogous to the first intention that directs the I symbol toward the consciousness. See figures 21, 22, and 23. In an emerging I symbol, there is a self-reference that directs it toward the threshold of consciousness, but as is observed in figure 23a, such a reference or first intention is in turn comprised of two basic references, an emotional and another rational one. Something similar occurs in a cultural fact, since the pain put into play by all the men who integrate its plot directs the meaning of the drama toward the threshold of meaning, from where the cultural fact has to emerge toward a world of meaning or macrocosmic conscious representation. We also said that the passu collectively fulfills the function of being the source of the world's reason. It is through its activity as a bidder of meaning that the reason of the world emerges, i.e., the axiological context, the connections of meaning of which are equivalent to the reasons of the cultural object. That the entities, until then submerged in the universal, acquire particular existence as cultural objects and are bound together by love, integrating themselves into the superstructures of the exterior cultures. Page 374. Of course, if the emergence of the cultural fact is an energetic process, an active potency that produces it must exist in its original extreme. This potency is that which the astral archetype contributes, transferring it from the axiological context in accordance with the principle of astral vitality. We will be able to comprehend the complete process if we first acknowledge the analogy between the demiurgic act of plasmating and the human act of affirming. With his vox, the demiurge plasmates an entity by supposing it. The demiurge plasmates the entity by subposing the particular design that puts an end to the universal archetypal nature. Analogously, with its expression, the passu affirms the essential matrix of the design by placing on it its general value that transforms it into a cultural object. It is easy to see that from the affirmation, it is easy to see that the affirmation is a kind of cultural plasmation of the designated entity, or, if you will, a confirmation of the essential matrix of the plasmated design. The passu, when it affirms the essential matrix of a designated entity, recognizes it with meaning because the former has also simultaneously confirmed the axiological context that determines it. This can be interpreted as follows. By affirming the essential matrix, the passu applies on the entity, on the essential matrix, an expressive force called pain, which is conformed by the axiological context and converted into meaning. The entity then has cultural meaning and can be recognized by the passu because it has emerged as a cultural object. If such an affirmation has been realized for the first time, it is enough for the passu to demonstrate the existence of the cultural object to the other members of its cultural community for a general value to be preserved in the cultural object. The cultural object will be, from then on, evident to all, since the whole community participates in its general value. As we said further back, after this collective recognition, a subsequent affirmation, much less a permanent recognition, is not necessary for the general value to be preserved. This occurs anyway because it has been recorded in the superstructure, more particularly in the connections of meaning of the axiological context. Let us suppose a cultural object that, in this manner, emerges by itself on the threshold of meaning and remains manifested, even if no passu or virya notices it. If that force modulated in meaning, which is pain, has once been applied by the passu, and it caused and directed the emergence of the cultural object in front of the passu, how is it possible that when ceasing the production of the force, i.e., when there is no expression or projection of the sign, the emergence continues? Answer: evidently, this can only happen if, when the passu's own force ceases, and it is Answer: evidently, this can only happen if, when the passu's own force ceases, it is substituted by another identical force, such a force that which produces the astral archetype by means of the vitality that it infuses through the connections of meaning or cultural records of the axiological context. When the individual force of the passu ceases, i.e., the expression of its pain, it is instantaneously substituted by an equivalent collective pain that sustains the emergence of the cultural fact with identical processes. The astral archetype maintains the general value of every cultural object in emergence. In a determinate cultural object, the connections of meaning transfer to it an active potency that produces the substitute force, i.e., the collective pain that enables it to preserve its general value. This active potency is none other than the astral potency of the universal collective unconscious, or deep astral world, region B. The astral archetype channels the astral potency through the connections of meaning on the cultural object, but the astral potency is then determined by the capacity of an essential matrix affirmed with general value. Its energetic manifestation, the astral energy, is conformed according to the affirmative force, i.e., as pain. But it is now a collective pain, a substitute force for the pain expressed by the passu. In any case, the collective pain maintains the emergence of the cultural object and preserves its general value. It is convenient to refresh the concept of astral potency and astral energy by rereading the following quote from page 424. The living macrocosm is animated by the soul of the demiurge, or anima mundi, which analogously to the potency of the passu's soul, W, or animic potency of the macrocosm, has the potential capacity to carry forth its plan. It is the astral potency equivalent to the potency W of the passu's soul. And such astral potency is also manifests itself in two principal modes: as vital energy of the astral world in order to sustain the life of the macrocosmic organism, and as astral energy in order to animate the superstructures of the cultural facts or external cultures. Let us take a look at the shadow sphere of the passu. In such an analogical space of the microcosm, the cultural structure subsists and the emergence of self-referent symbols occurs. The essential characteristic of every emerging symbol, as we saw in the first part, is the psychic energy. Analogously to the shadow sphere, regions A, B, C in figure 39, in the macrocosm exists the astral world, A, B, C, capital, in which subsist the exterior cultures and occurs the emergence of the cultural facts referred to the threshold of meaning. Thus, the essential characteristic of every cultural fact is the astral energy. Page 425. To summarize, once the passu projects the sign on the designated object and affirms the essential matrix with its individual force or pain, the entity acquires cultural meaning, a meaning determined by the axiological context. After the passu has made the cultural object known to its community, the general value is preserved in the superstructure because of the astral archetype. The cultural object receives the astral vitality from the connections of meaning that enables it to maintain its emerging general value. A more profound comprehension is made possible if the law of conservation of general value is interpreted by means of the superstructure model. It is necessary then to incorporate the principle of astral vitality into the superstructure model, and for this purpose, we must consider the cultural fact as in the form of a living organism. The cultural fact, in effect, supports the following organic analogy. If the ontic infrastructure is the skeleton of the cultural fact, comprised of entities internally vitalized by the universal archetypes, the superstructure of the cultural fact constitutes its organic anatomy, formed by cultural objects externally vitalized by the astral archetype. In other words, the superstructure of the cultural fact is analogous to an organism structured on the skeleton of the ontic infrastructure. In such an organism, the cultural objects represent the organs themselves, while the set of connections of meaning is equivalent to the trophic system. The astral archetype vitalizes the cultural objects, feeds them with the substitute force that sustains the general value by means of this system. But the psychoid archetypes or exterior myths also make use of the trophic system in order to articulate the dramatic plot of the cultural fact. In figure 75, for example, the structural cube on the left represents an organic cultural fact. The cultural objects, 1, 2, all the way up to 9, are there analogous to organs, and the set of connections of meaning, 1, 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 1, etc., is equivalent to the trophic system of the archetype. Is equivalent to the trophic system. The astral archetype vitalizes the 9 organs by means of the trophic system. A particular organ, 2, for example, is vitalized by the trophic connections 2.1, 2.3, 2.6, and 2.9 of the trophic system. Analogically, this signifies that the general value of the cultural object 2 is sustained by the axiological context 2.1, 2.3, 2.6, and 2.9 connections of meaning. With respect to the examples in subarticle E9, cultural object 2 can, of course, be either a book from the library or a tool from the hardware store. In either case, the general value that keeps them culturally visible comes from the vitality infused into them by the astral archetype through their respective axiological contexts, connections of meaning. All right. I think I'm going to stop there. How we doing? Oh, yeah. No problem, buddy. I think I'm going to stop there. I think that's a good stopping point. I'm starting to hear footsteps upstairs. I'll put a bookmark here. I finished both volumes of this series, and I've started reading volume 1 again. And this time I'm taking notes, writing down words and definitions. The first time I read it, it was just to read it, get the words inside of my head so that they could be digested and ruminated on and meditated on and contemplated. Not really prioritizing understanding every single bit fully as I read it, just wanted to get it in my mind so I could work with it. Now I'm reading it through a second time, intending on knowing what it means, every single bit of it. I want to understand it and be able to explain it to anyone, but I probably won't explain it to anyone. I'm going to explain it to cool people. If I even do that, I don't know. It kind of takes away. It might. I've theorized that it takes away from the significance of the experience by explaining it to somebody else. When you figure it out yourself, it has a pretty profound effect. And I wouldn't want to take that from somebody by giving it to them. It's kind of like a butterfly in a chrysalis. If it's coming out of its cocoon and you peel the cocoon apart to let it free, you're not doing it a favor because it has to be strong enough to break out by itself. And if it doesn't break out by itself and it doesn't gain that strength and that fight, it won't survive in the wild. I like that metaphor when using it in this context. I think maybe that's not a fair analogy. Maybe I'm totally wrong. I'm willing to humor that. But if I find something that I think is appropriate to read, I might do that. Certain things I'm open to discuss. Yeah, stages of figuring it out. Yeah. Yes. I've had a lot of changes in my personal life in the last 6 months. Like, I quit my job and I tried a new job and I didn't like it and I quit that one too, and I cashed out my 401k and I've been stretching that out. It's given me enough to live off of and enough time to formulate a plan of what I'm going to do next and also finish this book and more intently get into it. And so that's where I am right now. It's conflicting because I feel like if I went all in on this, I could do something that would be hard to explain with words because that's what the full potential is. I'm pretty certain I could do that if I really sat down and tried, but the implications of that are pretty heavy, and considering everything that I could potentially affect in doing that successfully or unsuccessfully, I'm being very careful about my timing. '96. What do you got here? 1996 by Gloria Naylor. I'll write that down. Check it out. Naylor. I'll check that out. Yeah, buddy. I'm not worried about the job thing at all. I work so hard. Like, even if I had to start over and learn a whole new trade, I would make it work. Like, I have energy to do it, and I have so much willpower. I know I'm not going to be young forever, but I do not stress work. Yeah, man, I'll keep doing this, and yeah, appreciate you, brother. Appreciate it. Appreciate it. All right. Stay tuned.